Okay, so welcome to the structural family therapy lecture. And so structural family therapy is really, it is one of just the cornerstones of the whole field of mental health. Now, if you're in family therapy or you specialize in family counseling and working with couples, families, and children, you probably use this theory quite a bit. You've heard a lot about it. But even if you work primarily with individuals, you will find the concepts in this super, super helpful because typically individuals will be talking about their experiences as a child in a family that were difficult, because most of our most difficult things we process in counseling and psychotherapy are our childhood relationships, right? That formative period. So, and then also if you're working with adults, let's say, or you're working with teens and children, they have families who are essential structural family therapy. I don't think you can do good therapy with children and adolescents without having a very strong understanding of structural, especially if you work with them individually. It's just essential. But then if you're working with adults who have children, just understanding structural family therapy is essential to discussing any issues related to parenting, to co-parenting. It really is a essential one. I would say one of the top 10 most essential theories to know, regardless of whether you're an MFT, a social worker, a counselor, a psychologist. I don't care. um, these are just some really important concepts to understand in the field, period, end of sentence. Now, pretty much every licensing exam, when they have, even if you're an MFT, you're going to see a lot of structural family therapy questions. But even in counseling, psychology, and social work, when they have family systems type things, this is one of the two main theories, the other being more of a systemic strategic type of concept, theoretical approaches, but structural and systemic strategic on all the other licensing exams besides MFT, that when they talk about family therapy, they're usually thinking of this approach combined with systemic strategic approaches. So really, really key and essential to know whether you're working with individuals, couples, or families. But structural family therapy is just invaluable. And it's when you begin to really get these concepts, your work, especially when talking about family relationships, is just going to be so much easier. So I hope that got your attention, even if you're like, I don't want to work with kids or I don't want to work with families. I promise you, this is super, super important, regardless of who you are working with, because we come from families. Many of us have, have our own families. And so all throughout our lives, especially when we come into the process of psychotherapy and counseling, family therapy, we are talking about these relationships. And so in structural family therapy, I think of it as like kind of getting an x-ray of the family. And so we are talking about the structure. So think about it as an x-ray of like the skeleton, um, of the family, of the family system. And so compared to the other kind of foundational family therapy approach, systemic strategic work, where they're in systemic strategic work, they're looking at the interaction patterns and kind of the dynamic that gets created. That's much more difficult, I think, to learn. Structural family therapy, when I teach a family therapy class, the students are like, okay, wow, that strategic systemic stuff was like impossible to understand, but structural, I can sort of understand it. So I always love talking about structural, because for most people, there's an intuitiveness. You're like, yeah, that makes sense. And so I love teaching this because my students nod in understanding and and ask fewer questions while learning structural family therapy. So hopefully this will be a nice kind of relaxing, kind of fun theory to learn. So let's go ahead and get started. Go. So, in a nutshell, the least you need to know. So, structural family therapy is an approach that certainly developed, as a family therapy approach first and foremost, but it addresses both individual symptoms as well as relational problems. And so, especially when looking at children and adolescents over the years, when we look at the research, many, if not almost all, virtually all evidence-based treatments that work for children and teens have a strong structural family therapy component. And so that is one of the reasons why, whether you're working with kids individually, or as a family, understanding structural family therapy is essential. You should not be working with children or adolescents without understanding the basics of structural family therapy if you look at what the research actually says. So it really is foundational to doing work with individuals, couples, and families. And so fundamentally, what this approach is doing is helping to realign the boundaries and hierarchies, which we will define very soon here, but realigning the family structure to promote the growth of all individuals of in the system, as well as the development of the system. There's a family life cycle that has its own developmental stages, as well as to resolve all the symptoms. So we're realigning the family boundaries, hierarchy, and structure to promote the growth of each member, as well as to resolve whatever symptoms. So when you're looking at, a family, especially if you've got kids who are symptomatic or teens who are symptomatic, we're looking to adjust the structure to promote their growth and to resolve any type of symptomatic issues. There is an emphasis on strengths, and so that looking to, seeing people as doing the best they can, kind of getting stuck maybe in a family transitional phase, but seeing families who are needing assistance to expand their coping skills, especially to deal with developmental issues, looking primarily at the family life, cycle of development. So, going from a couple to having their first child, to, entering the school years, to entering adolescence, launching, those sorts of things. That's typically where families get a little hung up when the shifts in the family development needs change, but the structure doesn't adapt to meet the developmental needs of either or the children and or the family itself. So looking at all of that. So for those of you who are familiar with my unifying framework, you're familiar with this table. So I'm working on a unifying framework for psychotherapy and counseling that basically breaks down conceptualization of problems from all the different theories, including the 50 theories in my textbooks, both counseling and family therapy, looking at there are 4 basic levels, and each one of these breaks down into 2 parts. And so this is just giving you really broad strokes of like how to compare structural some other approaches. So structural is going to be looking very much at the behavioral, what people are doing. It's also looking at what are called complementary patterns. Those are opposite patterns. So for example, in structural family therapy, we talk about having diffuse boundaries where there's enmeshment, right? The boundaries are blurry, versus rigid um, boundaries, okay? And so those are actually complementary patterns. I mean, Minucci doesn't quite cover it this way. And someday I will write a book that goes through all the major, theoretical foundations from, Freud to postmodern to EBTs. But you'll notice most every approach, there are some exceptions, but virtually every approach that does a formal case conceptualization, they look at complementary patterns. You just call them very different things, right? So like, and you look at defense mechanisms have a variation of this. In humanism, they look at polarities, right? The various schools look at that. It's a tiers, family systems, looks at all the different roles family members play, like the blamer and the placator. Those are like 2 complementary opposites. And so structural family therapy does it too. It's just less obvious. And when you look at, the different types of boundary patterns, you'll see that same examination of complementarity. So if you think of complementarity in mental health as we're always looking at polarities, and when those polarities become rigid and extreme, you typically will have some type of symptom, whether it's individual like depression or anxiety, or relational like conflict or cutoff. So Structural does that by how it's looking at the boundaries and also as to a certain degree at the hierarchy is where you see their handling of complementary patterns. And then they also address the cognitive approaches, cognitive beliefs of the family system. They do not directly focus on emotions and the societal narrative directly. I mean, certainly you can bring in, of course, an awareness of societal influences into any approach. It's not kind of cooked in and baked in at the fundamental approach, at least traditionally in structural family therapy. So a lot of what we're looking at here is what's happening behaviorally and then what's happening cognitively. Those are the main areas with attention to those complementary patterns. So this is really useful if you have my textbooks where you have all these different theories. Using this unifying framework helps you kind of understand the similarities and differences across approaches. For example, like all of the humanistic approaches in family therapy are looking at very similar family dynamics, but they're focusing primarily on the emotional levels, with some of them focusing more on attachment-based emotions and others talking about more the reactive kind of emotions on the surface. So anyway, interestingly enough, the other family therapy approach that looks at these two levels is similar to cognitive behavioral, does just the observable behavior. Cognitive behavioral is one of the only approaches that doesn't really focus on complementary patterns the way most other approaches do, as well as the cognition. So there's a similar feel that you might experience to some of the um, cognitive behavioral approaches, but it adds a complementary piece that those other ones don't. Okay, so moving on, the juice, the significant contributions in the field. So those of you who are familiar with my textbooks, specifically my family therapy textbooks, this is one of the few approaches that gets multiple forms of juice because it's just that foundational to understand, you know, no matter who you are, where you're working. And so if you haven't read my books, I talk about the juice. If there's one thing from this chapter you remember, it should be. Now, I've had professors really get annoyed with that phrase. Most students love this section. It's like, okay, this is the highlight. Thanks for pointing that out. So, but the juice is really, these are the things that no matter, whether or not you want to be a structural family therapist as your primary approach, I think these concepts are so valuable to anyone practicing psychotherapy or counseling, period, end of sentence. So in any of my books, when you see the juice, this is what I think this is their gift to the field. It's kind of what I think of it as. This is the gift to the field. So boundaries, which has really slipped into the vernacular, popular discourses you hear and can read about on social media and various other, news feeds, all about boundaries, setting boundaries, got to have boundaries. And so everyone's spouting about boundaries. Most people talking about them misunderstand them, and in many cases, I think actually do not do justice and don't even sometimes use them in ways that I don't think are actually all that emotionally healthy. So hopefully after listening to this, you're going to have a much clearer understanding what boundaries are and helping your clients understand how to work with boundaries more effectively. Because I certainly do see and read a lot of things that make me cringe nowadays when, people are talking about setting boundaries. So, and so I'm going to start with this. So when structural family therapists, and I think any well-trained mental health professional speaks about boundaries, what they are talking about the rules for relating with others. Okay. So, and generally you don't want to cut people off just because you don't agree with them or like what they're saying. And even if they're not always nice to you, there are ways to set healthy boundaries that doesn't end a relationship. And so boundaries should never be used or understood as a way to end relationships. If you listen to my intergenerational Bohemian family therapy lecture, cutoff is usually a sign of emotional maturity. So we're not going for cutoff with these boundaries. These boundaries are just kind of describing the rules for relating and how we manage distance and closeness between family members. Obviously, this term can be applied to anyone, friendships, co-workers, etc. But boundaries is about how our rules are for managing closeness and distance in relationships. And there are three basic types, okay? there are what is called clear boundaries. Now, it is so important to understand that there is a wide range of healthy, clear boundaries. And most of us, in fact, all of us, hello, all of us, we we think of clear boundaries as going into our own lives, our own cultural and gendered norms and all of our societal norms. And we each have our own kind of unique definition of what a clear boundary is. However, we need to be very careful as mental health professionals to not project those onto our clients because there's a very, very wide range. So, for example, many of us come from cultures that are more communal than individualistic. And so, like, I come from a very, very an immigrant, very rural. So rural communities in general tend to be more communal. Greek immigrant, poor background, and so what boundaries were normal in my family of origin are very different than the average family boundaries in the United States. And so I had to learn and really adjust what was normal. I literally there. McGoldrick has written several books called Ethnicity and Family Therapy that goes through 70 or more different ethnicities describing their family structures. I think it is, and even though obviously every family interprets their dominant culture version of culture differently, every family within a given culture does not interpret the dominant society the same. But it's a very useful book for when you're working cross-culturally with lots of different clients, because you should not be asking your clients to educate you about their culture, but understanding some of these norms. And this is one of the best books, which has been edited over the years for just describing the general contours, but understanding where you come from. And I remember it was her book that helped me understand individualistic cultures, because I truly did not. I thought I got them, and I sort of grew up in one, but I really didn't get them till I read her book. I'm like, oh, this is the logic of an individualistic culture, because I literally had to read her book to get it. So that means, as someone coming from a highly communal based value culture, when I look at more individualistic families where everyone's doing something different, they don't all get together for the holidays or birthdays, you know, I remember, would hear things. I'm like, that's not right. That's not normal, but that's just not my normal. And so it's very important for you to understand, kind of where your family may have defined healthy, normal, clear boundaries, how that fits maybe not only within the dominant culture that you're living in, you may be more similar or less similar, but then also how that relates to where your clients are sitting. So just know that clear boundaries are not the family you grew up in. And you may go, yeah, 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 I know. And it's also not the map you have in your head. And so there's no one set of behaviors that define clear boundaries. And so the litmus test Minuchin always said about how you knew that you were looking at clear boundaries is that no one has symptoms in the family system. So if no one has symptoms, then that's generally a sign that there are clear boundaries. But any other set of behaviors, like, do you knock on a door before you come in, or does everyone do family dinner together, or does everyone show up for someone's performance, or for a holiday, or for a birthday, or do you prioritize your personal needs over the family needs? That is dependent on many other values. I mean, and priorities that you as the clinician cannot be defining that for your clients. And so you have to look at whether or not people in the system are having symptoms, or their relational symptoms, hitting their developmental milestones. And that's how you know whether things are clear or not. So if you've got clear, and there's a whole wide range of clear boundaries, not just the ones that you think are clear, then knowing that there are, one extreme is having enmeshed or diffuse boundaries. And so this is where the needs of the group supersede the needs of the individual, to the point where it's detrimental to the individual. This means there's a over reliance on each other, and there isn't enough space to develop one's own individuality. Where disengagement is you're privileging the individual needs over that of the group. And so there's this disengagement, there are rigid boundaries, there isn't enough emotional closeness to have everyone meet their developmental needs or the needs of the system. So either extreme creates problems, and you just want to be slow before you go around labeling friends, family, and clients around their boundaries, because we all have a bias where we stand. And so in the first few years of doing this work, hopefully you're learning about where your biases are and learning to get better at correcting them. And so it's real important you're slow to slap these labels on people, and kind of assessing the boundaries. So, like I've said, the healthy is, there's a wide range of potential forms of healthy that can look very, very different. And it's not a particular behavior that's healthy. It's just how does that all, how do those rules play out in the system um, itself? And so also knowing that culturally, these boundaries can look very, very different. For example, a lot of folks in like North America who might look at, for example, like an Asian family or an Asian American, Asian Canadian family, they may look on the surface sometimes disengaged because culturally there's less emotional expression, but the actual structure of the family might be much more what would be called enmeshed or diffuse boundaries. For example, with parents weighing very heavily on, let's say, the child's career choice or marital choices, that sort of thing. And again, you just have to step back, be slow to label anything as problematic. And even when you're working, with clients from different cultural or other backgrounds, what is enmeshment? You're looking at the structure, not just the emotional expression. And for a lot of enmeshed communal cultures tend to have higher emotional expression, but it's not always the case. And so you need to be slow and thoughtful when you're assessing these. It's just not what you see on the surface. It's the structure of how things are relating, and whether or not symptoms are developing is really important when identifying boundaries. And so this is different than setting boundaries. So setting boundaries is kind of more in the pop psychology language. In structural therapy, they're talking about boundaries are just the rules for relating. They exist, they are. It's not something that you're setting, and that is a different vernacular. And so as a professional, to make sure you keep these terms straight. There's a lot of what people call setting boundaries. Intergenerational family therapists would be calling cut off, and cut off is not healthy. And boundaries can be healthy and they can be problematic. So it's much more generic when you're using the term professionally. The other thing to understand from Bowen, I mean, not Bowen, sorry, I started talking about Bowen, but from structural or enactments. And enactments are just some of the most powerful interventions in, I would say, couple family therapy, and in many ways gestalted enactments with the empty chair technique. So rather than having the empty chair that doesn't talk back to you, enactments are when you have two or more people in the room who need to communicate with each other. Enactments is the strategy for doing that. And so this is where you have the families complaining about a particular problem. And so you identify that, and you have them engage and talk to each other directly, but you're coaching them, okay? So there are 3 phases of a proper enactment, and you probably want to learn to do this under direct supervision, but let's go over the basics here. The first is you want to observe the spontaneous interactions, following, of course, both the content and the process. The processes of how they are relating. And you're listening for the rules and assumptions that are coordinating these interactions. And after you have assessed the boundaries, and we'll talk about hierarchy, these enactments are designed to help correct and teach the family in vivo how to relate in a more effective way. And that's essentially what this is. So, but you don't ever want to jump into an enactment without having a good assessment. So you know what you're going to need to do to get them to have a better interaction, right? So do not have this be your way of assessing. And just so you know, I never let a couple or family argue so I can see what it's like. I don't know I don't need to see what it's like. They can describe the awful fight that happened, later earlier that week, verbally in past tense, and that is hot enough. Never, I do not recommend letting couples or families argue and spiral in front of you so that you can see what it looks like. There is no family therapist who advocates for that, and that is not a good thing. So don't do that. There are very few things I say don't do, but letting just a couple argue to see what it looks like is horrible because they're going to get too hot, too triggered for you to do good intervention. They're going to be too upset, and many people feel very betrayed by you when you let that happen. Don't do that. So what you do is you will allow them to start whatever the or reenact typically the argument that they had, but you are very quickly going to step in and direct them on how to have a more effective conversation. So if this is a family that tends towards enmeshment, you will like often be pausing, letting the other person, speak, holding, waiting and allowing them to have turns, showing them how to do that. You might even rearrange their chairs a bit. If there's been triangulation, you will often reorganize the chairs and have two people who need to be talking, and the third person has been drawn into the conflict further away. If you have a family that's more disengaged, you're going to have structure the enactment to have them more directly talk to each other. You're bossy in an enactment, and you do not let things spiral out of control. In an enactment, you're highly active, helping them practice healthier ways of communicating, experiencing what that type of conversation is like, so that they can practice those. And this is so transformational. If you are familiar with emotionally focused couples and family therapy, they do a lot of these enactments to repair the attachment emotions and the attachment bond with the couple. And these can be really transformative very, very quickly. But you have to know as the clinician where, when, and how to direct the conversation, how to help each party learn some new skills in all of this to make these be effective. So never do these willy-nilly. Never just say, "Oh, just show me what happened," unless you've really got a clear handle on the structure and what you would need to do to intervene. Okay. So let's look real quickly just kind of at the big picture. Um, in terms of the overview of what treatment typically looks like in structural family therapy. So there are three basic phases. The first is what they call joining the family and accommodating to the family's style. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but Mnuchin's the one who used the term, I think, joining first. And he talks about how he's joining this system. He's learning to talk in the way that they talk and interact. So he's like studying the system. There's a bit of like being an anthropologist in this. Then you map the family structure, boundaries, and hierarchy. So you get that x-ray of the structure, and not just the surface level, but really what are the rules for relating? How do they work? And how are they relating to symptoms, both at an individual and relational level? And then you're intervening. So you connect, you join the system, you become part of it, where you create that sense of safety for them. You assess and map the structure, boundaries, hierarchy, and then you step in to intervene. Now, obviously, this mapping the structure and intervening, those two things will kind of continue throughout. You're always maintaining the joining, but those are the three basic phases. And generally, structural family therapists prefer to work with the whole family whenever possible, but not always insisting on it. Historically, there were some family therapists that did. Okay, so next, let's look at what the therapeutic relationship looks like. So joining is a structural term that's often used pretty broadly in family therapy in general, but you're accommodating to their style, their way of talking, their way of being. And it's more of an attitude than a technique or something you're doing to them. It's just your way of, I always tell my clients, I'm going to kind of follow your style. And I always say, let me know if I get it wrong. But, you're kind of following how they talk. Like recently, I was working with this one couple, and they were just hilarious. I mean, and so we ended up having unusually hilarious sessions, but because that was their style, they were super funny, right? I have other families who are much more. There's this more of a calm rhythm to them. Everyone has lots of time to speak, and no one's talking over each other. And so I will follow that style as well. So you're kind of like adjusting to their family culture rather than having them adjust to your therapeutic, relationship approach. And so there is a term called mimesis that meant copy in Greek, that you're kind of copying, and not in a mimicking way, but like you're going to be super flexible to relate to them in a way that feels very natural to them. And this is particularly important when working with clients who might be different from you and culturally or in other ways, that you're going to accommodate to their style rather than to your style. And that's also part of how you're getting to understand the rules for relating, is you're going to be using some of those rules, right? um, and there is also this talk about cultivating therapeutic spontaneity, which is a relationally and contextually responsive expression of self. So, kind of authentically being yourself, but within kind of the broader context of the logic of their system. And so this therapeutic spontaneity, there's this authenticity that you have, but you're also adapting to the family style and how you do that. So I can be authentically funny with some families. I can be authentically, calm and allowing a lot of space and time and silence with other families or clients. And so I can adopt a lot of different styles. And so I can do that authentically. Um, because hopefully, especially as a mental health professional, we have lots of ways of being in the world that are authentic, and you're going to bring that style. But it's funny, you kind of allow, in some ways, the family to set the rhythm. Like that one couple, they were just I think they're the funniest clients I've ever had. But I have several clients where we use just a lot more humor. You'll watch them with certain clients, and we were just funnier together, right? And some, it's more of a witty humor. There are different types of humor. Some do wordplay, right? I have one client where we just have this thing where we do wordplay. And I'm like, oh, I just have to say this pun, right? And so it's just part of how we relate and join. We like witty banter. Obviously, it needs to be appropriately timed, but you have this, that you're authentic, but you're still adapting to their style. And then there is a basic rule that they talk about, which is make it happen. And if you're familiar with any of the recovery-oriented work in mental health, they have the same motto. Structural family therapists had it long before that. But whatever happens, whatever's going on, is the therapist's job to make it happen, to make change happen. And we need to keep adapting, figuring out, reassessing, stepping back, asking ourselves, what do we need to do differently to make it happen? And so also being open to playing whatever role is necessary and beneficial for a particular family in a given session. And so your role might be more hierarchical or less hierarchical, depending, more direct, less direct, just depending on what that client or that family needs from you to promote change. And it's not about this role that you always play with all your clients. You're constantly adapting, and with what you're doing isn't working, do something different. Um, okay, so, and obviously there's empathy as part of this. Okay, oh, we got double bullets here. Okay, moving on here. So case conceptualization. So the first thing that one of the first things that a structural family therapist looks at, especially traditionally when working with a family, but you're going to do this with individuals and couples too, right? And with couples, you've got like each of their families of origins to look at. If they each have had kids with different systems, you got to assess all of those families. Sometimes you're assessing multiple family with multiple subsystems, but typically, let's say in a nuclear family, you're going to start by looking at the couple system, which is the the married partners. But oftentimes, especially in a nuclear family, that's the parental system. So this two people make up the same subsystem. And so this is one of the kind of default goals and things that they target, is the marital system clearly defined from the parental system. And many families, it becomes, especially the way we raise families and children in the United States right now, which I think is very problematic. It's like what happens for a lot of couples in the US, and there's a lot of societal pressure, and it's very normal and common. Let's say common, maybe not normal, but there's a lot of pressure for the parental subsystem to take over, and there's no time left to feed the marital subsystem. And this is a very common pattern in North American families that I've been seeing for several decades, at least 2 decades here. It wasn't always like this, but this in current, world. So you're looking at parental and subsystem is different. You can have a child in a parental subsystem. You can have a grandparent in a, it's a parentified child, right? So they would be in the child would be in a parental subsystem. You can have step parents, you can have grandparents, you can have aunts and uncles in a parental subsystem. So you want to assess who's in those two systems. You want to look at the sibling subsystems, and then you just want to listen for and look for other types of subsystems. Sometimes families can have very strong gendered subsystems, right? Or maybe particular interests like a sport, or the people who like to go camping and the people who hate to go camping in this family, or whatever it might be. There might be the characteristics, like I've seen, the introverted, half of the family and the extroverted half of the family. Whatever the family has, they develop really strong alliances. And then, of course, you do have boundaries with outside systems, which can be open um, versus closed. That should be open versus closed. There's a C missing on that slide. So is the family open to outside systems? Is it too open? Is it not open enough? Doesn't let anyone in, right? Then looking at their boundaries with extended family, community, schools. There's a lot of different types of subsystems and external systems that the family can be interacting with. And so those, again, can be more open or closed, which are basically diffuse or rigid. And so you're looking at all of these different dynamics. And like I said, you get a blended family, you've got a lot of family systems to kind of understand their structures. And that's often where the conflict will arise as well. Then we talked about boundaries already, but so that's one of the major. So after you get the subsystems, you want to know what the boundaries are like between all of those subsystems, and including individuals form theoretically kind of their own little subsystem of one person. The next big thing you're looking at, so you got the subsystems, you've got the boundaries, and next you're going to look at hierarchy. Typically, hierarchy applies to parent-child relationships. Sometimes you can have 3 generations. In some cultures, there is an expected hierarchy between, especially a husband and a wife, is in some traditional cultures. So that's something to be aware of. So there's a whole cultural component on what forms of hierarchy we're looking for, but in general, you're just looking for hierarchies. And so the parental hierarchy, though, is typically what you're assessing, especially if you've got a kid who's got behavioral issues. And again, an effective parental hierarchy cannot be just cookie cutter defined. It must look like this at this stage when the child's at this age, right? Again, like boundaries, effective hierarchy is, are there are the parents able to set age appropriate, limits and manage behavior in an age appropriate way? And so there is a range of what that can look like. There's no like one, if they're not doing this, they have failed parental hierarchy. Again, like boundaries, you have 2 extremes. In one direction, you find ineffective parental hierarchy where the parents are not able to manage the child's behavior, and there's too much what we call permissive parenting. In North America, especially the United States, in the last 20 years, there's been a lot more of this type of parenting compared to traditionally. There used to be more of an excessive hierarchy. So where the rules are too strict and unrealistic, and so it's too rigid. And so you can have either extreme, and sometimes you'll have parents polarize. One becomes the nice, parent, the other one's a strict parent. That is not a healthy. You want each individual person to have effective hierarchy, whoever's in the parenting system. So understanding this, and so often kids with behavioral issues, there has been inefficient hierarchy or excessive hierarchy. You get kids with behavioral issues with both of these extremes, And so but that's real important, especially with behavioral issues. And then you have things like a child who has, let's say, ADHD. They've been diagnosed with ADHD. They need a particular type of parental hierarchy for that to be effective. And so, what is an effective hierarchy for a child diagnosed with ADHD might be different than a child who's not, is typically different than one who is not diagnosed with ADHD. So, it's really what's effective for that child and working to allow the children and the parents and the family to hit their developmental milestones. So, but a hierarchy is a very important concept, and understanding how that works across the child's lifespan is also important. Okay, role of the symptoms. So one of the things that's very classic in family, if you're new to family therapy approaches, is looking at the role of the individual system within the individual within the broader family system. And historically, a family therapist would look at an individual symptom and make sense of how it helps balance the family's homeostasis or behavioral norms. And so that's a very traditional way of looking at family systems and the role of the symptom. Because some of the thought here is, so let's say you're under, a lot of stress or, whatever is going on. The form of, what your depression symptoms or anxiety looks like, or what that even looks like, is shaped in one way or another. And even if you have a largely biological causes, let's say, and let's say there's less, psychological or relational causes, the family and the culture we know is also shaping that in subtle or not so subtle ways. But there are three ways that structural therapists look at the symptom and how it might be related and maintained or be benefiting the family system. So, um, so in this case, one role of the symptom might be the family is an ineffectual challenger of the symptom. So, so basically what's happening is a highly enmeshed family system or highly disengaged, and it's not it's failing to challenge the symptomatic member, right? Another one where the family is shaping the individual's symptoms, where the family structure helps shape their experience and behaviors. And then there's another view where the family is the beneficiary of the symptom. So an ineffective challenger is kind of where the kids end up with more power than the parents. So the parents are not setting a healthy, they don't have a healthy parental hierarchy. The kids have way too much influence, and they're not able to challenge the acting out child. Okay, so that's one version of that, where the family is the shaper of the individual symptoms. So this can take a lot of forms. The first example that's coming to me is there's actually fairly common, believe it or not, it took me a while to believe this when I entered the field, but it is not uncommon for one child to remain highly symptomatic when it's time to launch. So like a teenager failure to launch. And it is because oftentimes there is tension in the marriage, and it's the family is kind of shaping that, not consciously or intentionally, but it's shaping it. Um, and then that's also where the family is the beneficiary of the system. So the family is benefiting. Actually, that's the failure to launch one. Sorry, because this is when I was going through this list. So that child's, let's say, depression, failure to launch, or failure to just show up academically. I've seen kids fail out junior, senior year, right? Often the youngest child in the system. The family's benefiting from them having those symptoms. And so the family as a shaper is oftentimes where the family structure is shaping the individual's behavior. Let's say a certain type of anxiety is being shaped by the rules of the system. Like I've seen kids with certain forms of anxiety where the family has been shaping their particular fears or worries. So there are we talked about normal subsystems. There are some particularly problematic subsystems which are called cross-generational coalitions. And these are when a parent and a child form a coalition against another parent, usually the other parent in this case. Obviously, this is super common in divorce, super unhealthy in divorce. It's what makes divorce so toxic, but you will find many intact families where this happens. In fact, sometimes I sit there with a teenager in the first 10, 15 minutes, I'm listening to him like, so let me get what it sounds like there's almost you and your, let's say your dad against your sibling and your mom. Is that what I'm hearing? Like there are two teams in this family? They'll go, yep, there are two teams in this family. That's a double cross generational coalition. Always unhealthy, never good. And so that's one of the first things that you're going to want to go in there and sever. Um, and these get super extreme in divorce, which is where so much of if there is emotional damage that comes from divorce, it is often because of these multiple cross-generational coalitions occurring. And they can be very covert. They may not always be on the surface. Sometimes everyone's conscious and well aware of who's on whose team, and sometimes it's a lot quieter, more of a passive aggressive. So targeting change, one of the things I love about structural family therapy is it's got some clear boundaries you can use with all your clients. Goal 1, clear boundaries between all subsystems, which include individuals, the couples, families, siblings, parental hierarchy, and parental and marital, which is actually so important that it is the second goal. So having a clear distinction between the marital subsystem and the parenting subsystems, very, very important. Or I guess, did I say that wrong? The marital/couple subsystem and the parental subsystem. Those need to be distinct. So this can be sometimes as easy as just, we're doing date, you're going to have to start doing date night once a week, but parental subsystem is different from the marital/couple subsystem. And for a lot of families today, this is, they might come in with a kid as the presenting issue, but often recreating and strengthening the marital subsystem is often very key to even help manage child issues. Then having the effective parental hierarchy, which includes severing all of those cross-generational coalitions, and then having finally kind of like your long-term goal is a family structure that promotes the development and growth of the individuals and the families as a whole. So we're not cutting people off with these boundaries, okay? We're keeping clear boundaries that allow for closeness and, individuality. So how do you maintain a relationship and your individual identity? That is a very difficult life skill. And that's what we're trying to help people do, not just cut off every relationship that they find triggering or upsetting to them.